Greetings, brothers and sisters in Christ. This is Pastor Tim, and today I'm going to be teaching on the book of Colossians. I'm going to give you an introduction to the book of Colossians. And in the coming weeks, Stephen and occasionally myself will be working our way through the entire book of Colossians. Now, Walter should have made copies of my translation of the book of Colossians. As I've said many times in the past, I like to spend the time to translate the books of the Bible myself as I'm going to teach them, so that I can make sure that I get all the juices, if you will, out of the text and make sure I have a really good understanding of it. It's mostly an exercise for my benefit, but he'll be handing you copy of my translation so that you can follow along. I'll be reading from my translation whenever I'm working my way through the book. And also, this book in particular has a lot of in-depth footnotes that I have because there's really a lot of background information with regard to this book that's very, very relevant and even necessary to have in your mind in order to understand what in the world Paul's talking about in several of the passages in this book. So what I'd like to do today is kind of lay that foundation for you, so you have the historical setting, what's going on, and what the Apostle Paul was trying to accomplish with this particular letter. All right, so let's start by talking about the Colossians themselves. Colossee was a city, a fairly prominent city in the western area of what is today Turkey. It was called, in ancient times, it was called Asia Minor, and it's right in the location of where the 7 churches in the book of Revelation were located. In fact, if you're familiar with Revelation chapters 2 and 3, you know that the book of Revelation was dictated, or at least the chapters 2 and 3 were dictated by Jesus Christ as 7 letters to be sent to the 7 assemblies that were in Asia Minor, and that was in this area. Now, Jesus did not dictate a letter to the church in Colossae. He chose 7 from among quite a few more that he could have chosen. But he chose 7 for a reason. He did not include the church or the assembly in Colossae in Revelation. But it's important that you understand the region. Excuse me. That Colossae was right in that region, the southern part of the region where the 7 churches or 7 assemblies of Asia Minor were located. In fact, the closest other assembly to Colossae that is listed in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 is the assembly in Laodicea. Laodicea was an extremely wealthy city. It had a lot of the more wealthy people live there in their mansions and whatnot. Probably a lot of businessmen, things of that nature. Well, Colossae is just kind of down the road, just a few miles away from Laodicea. And there's a third city sort of making up a trio of cities that were close together, and that was Hierapolis. And that city is also mentioned in the epistle of the Colossians as well, and there was an assembly there as well. So you kind of get the general gist of the area. Now let's talk about the time period when the book of Colossians was written. You may remember that from the Bereans lessons in Module 7, I believe it was, that the Apostle Paul's first epistle, the first one that he wrote at the very beginning, almost the very beginning of his ministry. All right, you remember his ministry started to the Gentiles, that is. He did do some preaching to the Jews, but his ministry to the Gentiles began 14 years after Pentecost. And it was at that time that Paul was sent out from the church in Antioch, and he was sent out west. Antioch's in Syria, all right, but he was sent west into the area of what's today Turkey. It would be Eastern Turkey, not Western Turkey, where this Colossae is, but in Eastern Turkey, where he made his first missionary journey with Barnabas. And that area where the Apostle Paul established about 4 churches or 4 assemblies was the area of what is called Galatia. Now, the book of Galatians was Paul's first epistle. It's the first one he wrote. It was written at the end of that first missionary journey when he went back to Antioch, where he started his mission to the Gentiles from. And then shortly after that, while he was staying there, he heard about some problems in Galatia, all right, the area of Galatia, and how there were what is referred to as Judaizers. That is, there were these Jewish Christians who had come out of the church in Jerusalem with a Pharisee background, and they were polluting some of the message that Paul had preached. And in Galatians, Paul was trying to counter this with a letter that he wrote to them. And they were essentially teaching that Christians needed to observe the law of Moses, including be circumcised, including the dietary laws, including, everything. All the festivals, go to Jerusalem for the festivals, all that stuff that the Jews were required to do. These sort of converted Pharisees were out coming behind Paul and proclaiming to these new Gentile converts that they had to basically become Jewish in order to be Christians. And so the book of Galatians deals with that entire problem, all right, trying to address that whole problem, which was close to the beginning of Paul's ministry. Now, the book of Colossians, however, was written towards the end of Paul's ministry. See, Galatians being written somewhere around AD 45, 46, somewhere around there. And Colossians now is one of the last epistles that Paul wrote. It was written during Paul's imprisonment in Rome. That is his first imprisonment. He was imprisoned twice. You may remember, as we worked our way through the book of Acts in Module 7 of the Bereans Bible Institute, that the book of Acts ends with Paul in prison in Rome for 2 full years. And then at the end of that time, he was released for a short time, for maybe a couple of years, and then he was rearrested. He was taken back to Rome, and after that imprisonment, Paul was executed. But the book of Colossians is one of Paul's, what is referred to as his prison epistles. And that is his first imprisonment, because there are other books written during his second imprisonment, which would be 2 Timothy, Titus, and Hebrews. But in any case, the book of Colossians was still written towards the end of his ministry during his first imprisonment, that 2 years that's recorded in the last chapter of Acts. Now, it was also written along with a couple of other books that are also called the prison epistles, that were all written within that 2-year time frame when Paul was in prison in Rome the first time. Now, the other books are Ephesians and Philippians and Philemon. Now, the book of Philemon is a really interesting book, and it's very short. It's only 1 chapter. But as we work our way through the book of Colossians, we are going to be mentioning the book of Philemon from time to time, because the book of Philemon is intertwined with the book of Colossians. In fact, In Colossians chapter 4 and verse 16, let's actually turn there for just a minute, if you would. If you have the translation that I made that was handed out to you by Walter, use that. If you don't have one, then just use your whatever translation you have. But in any case, go to Colossians chapter 4 and verse 16. This is at the close of the epistle to the Colossians, and as he's sending greetings and things like that, he says, "And when this letter should be read to you, make sure that it is also read in the assembly of the Laodiceans." Now that was the sister city next door, right? "And that you read the letter from Laodicea." Now, it's clear here that Paul was referring to another epistle that he wrote that was to be carried to the church or the assembly in Laodicea. Now, the problem is we don't have a book in our New Testament called Laodiceans. It's not there. And a lot of Christians down through history, in fact, the majority of Christians down through history, have simply thought that Paul's epistle to the Laodiceans has been lost. And there is no copies, no fragments, no nothing of an epistle to the Laodiceans. However, we do have the epistle of Philemon. And what I'd like to show you, just from a few references, is that the epistle of Philemon was actually appended to the book of Colossians. And it is, in fact, the letter to the assembly in Laodicea that Paul mentions at the end of Colossians. That is, when the book of Colossians was sent by Paul to be carried back from Rome to the city of Colossee, the person who was entrusted to carry that letter back was a slave by the name of Onesimus. And the book of the book of Philemon is all about Onesimus going back home and his owner, because he was a slave, his owner receiving him back because of Paul's letter, which is the book of Philemon, which was Paul's letter to the owner of this slave named Onesimus, who had become a Christian under Paul. He had fled, he had escaped from Laodicea and from his master, who was Philemon, who was a Christian. He had escaped and he had fled, and he ended up in Rome, and somehow or another he came in contact with the church, the assembly in Rome, and with Paul, who was in prison in Rome at the time, and Paul had led him to Christ. And he became a Christian under Paul's ministry in Rome. And so the book of Philemon is essentially a letter that Paul wrote to be carried by Onesimus, along with the Colossian epistle, to go back to the area of Colossae and Laodicea, sister cities, to send him home to his master, and for his master not to punish him. All right, but Onesimus carried this letter of the book of Colossians with him back to the church or the assembly in Colossae. Now, let me show you that in the Bible. All right, so let's actually go to Philemon, chapter 1. There's only one chapter, of course. It's Philemon is towards the end of Paul's epistles. It's in our Bibles, it's listed last in Paul's epistles. It would be just before Hebrews, even though Hebrews is technically one of Paul's epistles. But anyway, go to the book of Philemon for just a minute, and let's read verses 8 through 22. It says, "Therefore, though I might be very bold in Christ." Now remember, Paul is writing to the owner of this slave who has escaped. Therefore, though I might be very bold in Christ to command you what is fitting, yet for love's sake I rather appeal to you, being such a one as Paul the aged, and now also a prisoner of Jesus Christ. He says a prisoner of Jesus Christ because he's in prison. I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten while in my chains, who once was unprofitable to you, but now is profitable to you and to me. I am sending him back. You therefore receive him, that is, my own heart, whom I wish to keep with me, that on your behalf he might minister to me in my chains for the gospel. But without your consent I wanted to do nothing, that your good deed might not be by compulsion, as it were, but voluntarily. For perhaps he departed for a while for this purpose, that you might receive him forever, that is, as a brother, instead of a slave. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. If then you count me as your partner, receive him as you would me. But if he has wronged you or owes anything, put that on my account. I, Paul, am writing with my own hand. I will repay, not to mention to you that you owe me even your own self. Besides, that's because Paul was the one who led Philemon to Christ a long time before. So anyway, Paul is sending this letter by the hand of Onesimus, writing it while he was in prison in Rome, and sending it back to Philemon. Now, what's interesting about this, let's go to, actually flip over to Colossians. Use my translation if you would. If not, use your own. Go back to Colossians chapter 4 and look at let's read verses 7 through 9. He says, Tychicus, these are the closing comments, all right? Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful servant and fellow slave in the master, will make known to you all my affairs, whom I send to you for this purpose, so that you may know that which concerns you, and he may comfort your hearts, along with Onesimus, the faithful and beloved brother. And now notice these last words, who is out from you. That is, he is from this area here of Colossee and Laodicea. So it's clear then, if he's sending him home and if he is from this area, that Philemon, who he was sending him home to with the letter, which is the book of Philemon, to deliver to Philemon himself, and also to carry the letter of Colossians, as he says here in the last verses of Colossians, to carry this letter back to Colossee, that it's clear that Paul was using Onesimus as this letter carrier, if you will, sending him back home to his master, and at the same time carrying the letter of Colossians back to the church that was at Colossae at the same time. All right, now, the objection to this might be, well, the book of the so-called lost book of Paul's epistle to the Laodiceans is Paul says here in Colossians that it was the letter to the Laodiceans, plural, that is, to the whole assembly in Laodicea. But if you look carefully at the book of Philemon, you will see that it's not just addressed to one man. Philemon was almost certainly one of the elders or the elder of the church in Laodicea, or the assembly in Laodicea. And the letter that Paul sent back with Onesimus, this book of Philemon, was addressed not only to Philemon, who was probably the leader of that assembly, but also to the whole assembly that met in his house. Now, if you can see that in the opening verses of the book of Philemon. Let's go back to Philemon for just a moment. And Paul says this. He says, Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother. Timothy was with Paul at the time of the writing. To Philemon, our beloved friend and fellow laborer, to the beloved Apphia. Now, Apphia is a female name. It's a feminine name in Greek. So Apphia very well may be Philemon's wife. And Archippus, our fellow soldier. Who is Archippus? Well, he was somebody from the assembly in Laodicea, or he might even have been Philemon's son. But in any regard, he says, and to the church or assembly in your house. So it's clear that the book of Philemon is not only written to one man. The book of Philemon is written to the whole assembly, of which met in Philemon's house. And because he's sending Onesimus back with this letter to Philemon and to the assembly that meets in his house, which was basically next door to Colossee, and the assembly there, then when Paul says to have the letter that, to have this letter, the Colossian letter, he says to the Colossians, have this letter read also in the assembly in Laodicea, and also I want you to have the letter I'm sending to Laodicea, I want you to read that as well to the assembly in Colossae. So they were to read the letters from, each congregation was to read both letters. All right, or have them read in the assembly. All right, so it's obvious that, in my opinion, it's obvious that there is no lost book of the New Testament. There is no lost book to the church of Laodicea that we don't have. It's the book of Philemon. In fact, we probably, in fact, in my translation, I've already translated the book of Philemon. It's on the website, but I have it labeled as Paul's epistle to the Laodiceans. And I'm going to keep it that way, and I have an extensive footnote there explaining that, all that we just talked about. All right, so anyway, what you need to do is you need to sort of, in your mind, understand that the epistle to Philemon is sort of an appendix to the letter that Paul wrote to the Colossians. All right, enough of that for now. Now, one more thing I want to point out also. Because Philemon had slaves and servants, and because he lived in Laodicea, and because the church or the assembly met in his house, he almost certainly had a large house and was very wealthy. Well, the fact is, when we read Jesus' letter to the assembly in Laodicea that he wrote, Jesus dictated to John in Revelation chapter 3, which was decades later. All right, it was three decades later. At that time, Jesus was rebuking that assembly in Laodicea because he said that they say, I am rich and I don't need anything. I have need of nothing. And Jesus says to them, but you don't understand that you're poor and you're blind and you're naked. Well, it's this elitist kind of mentality that a lot of the rich had that had led to that kind of condemnation that Jesus brought against that assembly much later. Now, it probably wasn't that way when Philemon was leading it up. Okay, it may have just gotten that way later. But in any regard, had it been that way, no doubt Paul would have had some rebukes in the book of Philemon for that assembly. But he did not, and so we can infer from that at least as far as we know, the assembly in Laodicea at this time was a faithful assembly that was doing what they ought to be doing. All right, now let's talk about the circumstance that Paul was trying to deal with. I mean, why did he write this particular letter at this particular time to this particular assembly that met in the city of Colossae? Well, what we need to understand is that there was in this area of Asia Minor, this whole area, the whole area that includes all of the 7 churches or 7 assemblies that are in Revelation, this whole area was referred to as Phrygia. In fact, that term, you'll see that in the book of Acts, that the Apostle Paul actually twice was preaching the gospel in the area of Phrygia. Now, we don't know that he went to Colossae. All right. In fact, in the opening verses of the book of Colossians, Paul makes it clear that that church was not started by him. It was started by a man named Epaphras, who at the time was actually in prison with Paul in Rome. And so no doubt, because of their communication together and Epaphras having concern for the church that he started, the assembly that he began back in Colossae, where he was from, that because of some problems that he heard about that were going on there, the Apostle Paul then took it upon himself to write to this assembly that was started by this man named Epaphras. All right. So anyway, so what's the circumstance? Why is Paul writing there? Well, this area of Phrygia, you all know the story. I hope you know the story of Antiochus Epiphanes and the story of Hanukkah, right? Well, around 165 BC, this very vile and wicked Syrian king who had control over all this area, the area of Phrygia as well as the area of Judea, all around Jerusalem and Judea, all that around Israel, and he also had control well into, or pretty much all of what is today Turkey, was all under his dominion, and he transported several thousand, I believe it was 2,000 Jewish families from Babylon into the area of Phrygia. And I'm sorry, it wasn't Antiochus Epiphanes. I'm sorry, it was his father, Antiochus III. Okay, he's the one who transported all these Jews into the area of Phrygia in Asia Minor. Now, why were there so many thousands of families of Jews still living in Babylon? Well, it's because they were Jews who did not return at the end of the Babylonian exile, but they kind of put down roots in Babylon, and this, we're talking going back 500 years before Christ. But you know the story of the return from the exile under Cyrus and all that. He gave command to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. Well, a lot of Jews went back to Israel, but a lot of them didn't. And a lot of them liked living in foreign lands. They liked the lifestyle, the culture. Some of them, just became corrupt. They adopted idolatry. They adopted the ways of the Babylonians. They didn't think it was all that important necessarily to travel, to Jerusalem 3 times a year to keep the festivals, which was required of all Jews. But they didn't do that because they were so far away, right? So they weren't really keeping the law. Well, in addition to that, these are some of the people that Antiochus III transported from Babylon into this area of Turkey, or what is referred to as Phrygia in the Bible. And these Jewish families settled down there and were a large Jewish population in this area. Well, because they were not involved in the priesthood and the temple, and let me give you another reason why they weren't involved in the temple worship and the priesthood, and that was because Antiochus III, his son, took the throne, who is referred to as Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes is the guy that the story of Hanukkah is about, right? He's the guy that came down and defiled the temple in Jerusalem and put the statue of Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar, and he slaughtered many Jews, and he forbid them from observing the Sabbath or any of the festivals, and he tried to force them to adopt Greek pagan customs. And this was his practice all over his empire that stretched all the way from all of Turkey, all of Syria, into Babylon, into Iraq, down into Israel, right, and up to Egypt. And then there was constantly this battle between Egypt and the Syrian king over this border, right? He was the Syrian king, Antiochus Epiphanes, was constantly trying to take Egypt, and Egypt was constantly rebuffing that and also trying to overthrow Antiochus. And there was all this stuff going on in this intertestamental period. But anyway, all that to say this, that Antiochus Epiphanes' insistence on forcing Greek customs, Greek worship of the Greek gods, adoption of Greek ways of dress, of everything, including Greek philosophy, that this was, adopting that was what he did. He thought that forcing what is referred to as Hellenization upon all the people that he controlled, he viewed that as his means of keeping his empire together, right? If he could keep everybody having the same gods, the same worship, the same language, Greek as their language, and all these things, that he could cement his empire and keep it from breaking up. Well, it's the same kind of thing that happened much later with Constantine, with the Roman Empire, and adopting Christianity in order to try to keep his empire together. And that ended up turning into Roman Catholicism. But that's a topic for another day. All right. But anyway, what happened during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes was that there was a struggle. And what really set off this whole thing, this whole story of Hanukkah, was there was a struggle in Jerusalem between two factions who wanted to be the high priests class at the temple. And instead of it being handed down, from generation to generation in the same family, there was another family of priests in Jerusalem that thought they should be have the high priesthood. And so there was all this political intrigue going on. And because there was violence and clashing between these two factions, and because Antiochus Epiphanes had control ultimately over the whole area, it kind of set off a chain of events where Antiochus Epiphanes thought he had to get involved. And what he did was he installed the high priest in Jerusalem that he wanted to have there, the one who would be more sympathetic to him. And then there was all kinds of intrigue and struggle going on back and forth between different parties who thought that they had the right to be the priests in the temple of God. Anyway, it was a total mess. But what came out of all that was this idea of Hellenization, this idea of forcing Greek thought, Greek customs upon the Jews, was really successful in many ways. And what you see is, beginning at this time, around the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, is you see all of a sudden there are these large populations of Jews who are not living in Israel, but who are adopting Greek ways, but not just Greek ways, but Greek thought. That is, they're absorbing Greek philosophy, they're absorbing Greek mysticism. And the Greeks had sort of they had all this big mythology about all these gods, right? I mean, there were, you had Zeus and you had all these other lesser gods, and there were always, this god fornicating with that god and producing another god, and then that god marrying another god and producing another god, and they had all these levels of gods, and they were all their mythologies involved all these gods who killed each other in order to take a wife. And I mean, it was insane. Okay, it's just totally insane, the Greek mythology. But what these Jews did is they just took that way of thinking and they adapted it to Judaism. And so what they did is they developed a mythology that mirrors Greek mythology, but instead of having gods per se, they just used angels. That is, angels of the God of Israel. And so they had all these levels of gods and of angels, and their new, I would call it a sort of a hybrid Judaism. It was a mixture of Judaism mixed with Greek philosophy and Greek mythology. And so we call these people Jewish mystics. They're sort of a mystical form of Judaism. And they adopted a lot of the thinking of the Greeks, particularly Plato. Now, we have talked in our, back in several modules ago in the Bereans Bible Institute, we talked about the immortality of the soul, and we talked about how that worked its way into Judaism, how that there were three sort of sects within Judaism. There were the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and then the Essenes. Well, the Essenes fit into this category of Jewish mystics, that is, Jews who had taken the Judaism as it was revealed by God and the prophets and sort of reinterpreted it in the mold of Greek thought, in the mold of Greek philosophy and of Greek mysticism, Greek mythology, I should say. All right. And so they blended these things together. So they simply took the concepts in the Old Testament and they approached them from this Greek way of thinking. So, and also keep in mind that because of the infighting about who was going to have the priesthood in Jerusalem, these Jews who were adopting Hellenistic ways, they didn't want anything to do with the priesthood in Jerusalem anymore because, their party ended up losing out. It became the Sadducees who ended up with the high priesthood, right? And so these other Jews who were part of the opposing parties, they felt left out, and so they were not going to go to Jerusalem to observe the festivals. They were not going to bring their sacrifices to those other high priests, right? They wouldn't do that anymore. So what they wanted to do was sort of adapt their Judaism to a culture that has nothing to do with Israel, with the Holy Land, with Jerusalem, and with the temple, and with the priesthood. But yet at the same time, they didn't want to abandon their heritage altogether. And so what they did was they blended the two. They took the law of Moses and they began to interpret it as though it was allegory instead of literal with regard to a lot of the commands, right? Now in the law, they were required to separate between what was called unclean and what was called clean, and they had all kinds of rituals they had to go through. You could touch this animal, you can't touch that animal. All these things that were in the law, and they were in the law in order to teach Israel to practice dividing between clean and unclean. Well, what the Essenes did, and these other Jewish mystical sects, is they made it all about, what they did is they interpreted it through Plato's philosophy. Now, Plato's philosophy, in a nutshell, if you haven't been with us long enough to understand this, Plato taught that a man was a ghost or a soul, a ghost living inside of the body, which was a prison. And his writings reflect this idea that a man is really not what you see on the outside. A man is a spiritual creature that has been punished by being imprisoned in a flesh body and sent down here to earth and imprisoned in a flesh body. So they had this idea of the descent of souls, that whenever a child is conceived, that a soul or a ghost of a person that's in heaven is forced down into this human baby's body and then has to go through this whole process of growing up and learning and all that kind of stuff to supposedly make it to learn certain things. And then, when it died, then you had reincarnation, then it goes into another body, and you got this cycle happening over and over and over again. Well, the Jewish mystics adopted that kind of thing. And they had the idea of immortality of the soul. And because of that, when you die, it was a release from the prison of the body. And so, the soul would allegedly eventually ascend into heaven. So they had their eyes on heaven as being their destination, just like Plato did and all the Greeks at that time. as opposed to the true Jewish hope that's found in the Old Testament, which is the resurrection of the body. And so the Essenes denied the resurrection. And they had this immortality of the soul idea. All right. There were other issues that the Essenes, or I'm going to call them Essenes. They may not have always been called Essenes in this area, but they are the same kind of Jewish mystics that that are referred to as Essenes by Josephus. Anyway, they adopted this allegorical approach to the Old Testament, and the reason they did was so that they didn't have to go to Jerusalem to observe the festivals. And so they reinterpreted this idea of, the rituals for that were meant to teach Israel holiness. They reinterpreted those as being rituals that were personal rituals for them. And because they had adopted the Greek way, the Greek philosophy of Plato, the flesh, the body, was considered to be vile and evil. Everything material was considered to be evil. And so their hope was to escape the flesh, escape the body, escape the physical creation, ascend into heaven as pure spirit. And so because they thought that they themselves were these spirit beings living inside of a body that was vile and corrupt, then what they did is they tried to take these rituals in the Old Testament, which deal with clean and unclean, and they tried to apply them to their private life with regard to the body. That is to try to make this body as clean a vessel as they possibly could, so that their eternal ghost, if you will, would not be contaminated by dwelling in it, or at least it would minimize that contamination until they could escape this body of flesh and ascend. All right, so what we find is they became very, what we would call monastics, like monks, right? They don't want to touch, they don't want to intermingle with the rest of society. They want to stay separate from society. They don't participate in anything that society does. And this was reflected in everything about their way of life. It was reflected in their clothing. They just wore white robes. They would not wear colors. And they only wore certain materials, because any other material was considered to be, unclean. Their diet, they went extreme. The law of Moses said that Israel was to abstain from certain unclean meats, but they were allowed to eat what God had determined were clean meats. But because they thought flesh itself was unclean, they became vegetarians. And they, for the most part, they would not eat meat. So it's just vegetarian diet. And they thought by doing these things that they were more holy. Well, they also, many of them, maybe not all of them, but many of them also forbid marriage, because they thought that sex itself, whether you're married or not, that it was intercourse itself was vile. And so it was unclean. And so in order to keep themselves pure, so they thought, they even forbid marriage. And we see actually that, an example of Paul referring to these people, these Jewish mystics, in 1 Timothy chapter 4, when he says that in the latter days, well, actually, let me read it, because I had it on the tip of my tongue and then I lost it. So go to 1 Timothy real quick, chapter 4, verse 1. He says, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own consciences seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who Believe and know the truth. For every creature of God is good, and nothing is to be refused if it is received with thanksgiving. And so what Paul was talking about here was this Jewish mystic thought was actually beginning to invade some of these new Christian assemblies. And it was because they were living in areas where there were large populations of these Jewish mystics who thought they were more holy than everybody else because of these practices. And so what we see in the book of Colossians is the Apostle Paul actually addressing all these issues that were causing conflict between the influence from these mystic Jews into the Christian assembly in Colossae, because the assembly in Colossae, they ate meat. They didn't have any problem eating meat. And, they didn't have any problem wearing all different color and material clothing. And they didn't have any problem, participating in things of society, even if it, unless it was something obviously unclean. They didn't have any of these issues. But it was infecting the church because a lot of people were thinking, well, they're more holy than we are as Christians. And so, as they interacted with these Jewish mystics, some of that thinking was beginning to creep into the Colossian assembly. And so the Apostle Paul was trying to head it off at the pass. And that's what the whole book of Colossians is about. All right, pretty much from beginning to end, the entire book of Colossians is about that. Now, another thing that the Jewish mystics did was they had their own calendar. In fact, if any of you are familiar with the book of Enoch, it's one of those non-biblical books that some Jews had written during the time, after the Babylonian exile, but before Christ. It's one of those mystical Jewish books. And many of the concepts that the Apostle Paul addresses in Colossians is countering the ideas that are contained in the book of Enoch. If you haven't ever read it, you ought to read it sometime just to see how ridiculous and silly some of the mysticism is that the Jews had. But one of the important things with regard to the book of Enoch is that it lays out this concept of angels communicating and bringing God's revelation to man, and all these different levels of angels and whatnot. And the book of Enoch also talks about a Messiah, if you will, which no doubt they drew from the Old Testament prophets. But it has a Messiah figure that in some ways is very similar to Christ as we know him in the New Testament, but in other ways not so similar. All right? But it was because of that Messiah figure that's in this, what is referred to as Enochic Judaism, the kind of Judaism that you see in the book of Enoch, which was the same as the Essenes. All right, in fact, the book of Enoch was probably written by Jewish mystics like the Essenes, if not the Essenes themselves. Anyway, they had this Messiah figure that they were looking for. And so when they came in contact with Christians in Colossae who had a Messiah figure also, who also had their religion rooted in Judaism, well, you can see that these two religious movements, if you will, shared some things in common, but at the same time, there were some things that were in stark contrast. And one of the things that the Apostle Paul deals with in great detail at the beginning of the book of Colossians is who this Messiah figure really is, that it's Jesus Christ and where he came from, and what is his relationship to the Father as opposed to angels. Hebrews also does this to some degree, showing that Christ is higher than the angels. And it's also because the book of Hebrews was addressed to Jews, some of which were also having influence from these mystical Jews as well. And so the first couple of chapters in Hebrews is all about how Christ is greater than the angels, and so forth. So anyway, that kind of gives you a time frame about it. All right. Now, one more. I just have one more quick point. The Jewish mystics also had a special calendar, because the calendar of the Jews in Israel was dependent on the priesthood. They only set their calendar 1 month at a time, because they had to observe the new moon in order to begin their months, and then they could calculate what day of the month the feasts were on that particular month. And that's why, on Rosh Hashanah, they had to go out and sight the new moon and blow the horn, right? And so then the priesthood would say, okay, today's the first day of the month. And so the calendar in Israel was linked to the month. It was linked to the lunar cycles. It was linked to the new moons. Well, because the Jewish mystics lived outside of Israel, lived in other places, they needed a calendar that would suit them. And so they had their calendar. Basically what it did was it disassociated all of the festivals from linkage to the priesthood in Jerusalem. And the way they did it was they just gave an assigned date to the festivals. See, the festivals actually were supposed to be on a date of the month. But what the Essenes did is they established a calendar that had an even number of weeks instead of an odd number. It had an even number of weeks. Our calendar today does not have an even number of weeks. It's 52 weeks plus a few days. Okay, not a full week. Well, they shortened their year slightly so that it had exactly 52 7-day weeks in it. All right. Now, that was fairly close to the solar calendar. So what they were trying to do is get away from the lunar calendar, use a solar calendar, and by doing so, they then fixed the festivals on specific dates on their calendars, and their months were always calculated by a certain number of weeks, so that no matter where you were, you didn't need the priests in Jerusalem to tell you when the new month started. So the mystical Jews, what they did is they celebrated their feasts in a allegorical way as opposed to literally going to Jerusalem. And they did so not at the same time, not on the same days that it was celebrated at the temple, but according to their own calendar. And we'll see in the book of Colossians, when we get into, I think it's chapter 2 or 3, that Paul even deals with the calendar issue, because there was conflict between the Christians who were using the Jewish calendar from Jerusalem, and between them and these mystical Jews who had a new calendar that they used in order to celebrate the holidays. So there was conflict as to which, not only how to celebrate the holidays, but also what dates to celebrate the holidays on. The Christians saying, no, it must be calculated by the new moons, and the Essenes saying, no, it's calculated by our calendar on a particular count of weeks. So we had this argument going on between the Corinthians and Colossee and the Essenes or the Jewish mystics in Phrygia. All right, so I think that's enough to get us started into the book. As we begin in chapter 1 next week, we'll start developing these themes and show you how the Apostle Paul is trying to counter these things. Now, I just want to say one final thing before I end, and that is that a lot of people confuse the Jewish problem in Galatians with the Jewish problem in Colossians. And these books are separated by decades, and they're separated by a large territory. The Christians in Galatia had been influenced by the so-called Pharisee mindset. That is sort of a legalistic Judaism that was centered in the temple and in the priesthood at the temple. But the Jewish problem that Paul addresses in Colossians is not centered in the temple. It's not centered in the Pharisaical way of thinking. It's instead a clash between Christians and mystical Jews who have developed this other mystical Judaism, which is referred to as Enochic Judaism. In fact, that calendar I was telling you about is actually given in the book of Enoch. Also, there's another book that belongs to that sect, which is called the Book of Jubilees, which also teaches a lot of these same concepts as well. All right, so I think that's enough foundation material. I gave you guys a lot of stuff to think about. I know you're not going to remember it all. But as you read through the book of Colossians, you will see, in my translation, you will see a lot of footnotes. I encourage you, as you come across a footnote number, to go down and look at the footnote, because the footnotes are going to explain to you how Paul in the text is countering these concepts that were, from these mystical Jews that were beginning to infect the assembly at Colossae, and how he deals with those things. All right, so he keeps the Christian assembly pure with the truth, the true apostolic teachings of Christ. All right, well, God bless you all. It's been a pleasure being with you, and I look forward till next time.